much, Barbara. That was a fabulous introduction, and so pleased to be here today. And thank you very much for your partnership at International Women in Mining during this week, which is International Women's Day celebrations for this particular event. So this is the first time the FTSE Women Leaders Review has participated in this way. We're absolutely thrilled to do so. So my name is Vivienne Artz. I'm the Chief Executive of the FTSE Women Leaders Review. And I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the review, about the mining sector within the review, why we have the review, and then we can engage in our panel discussion. So if we go to the next slide. So what is the FTSE Women Leaders Review? Well, actually, it started in 2011 and was called the Davies Review. Lord Mervyn Davies was asked to have a look at the representation of women on the boards of the FTSE 350 companies in the UK, which are the largest private companies in the UK. And he came back and said, oh my goodness, 9.5% women on the boards. And that was when the Davies Review started. And so over a 5-year period, a target of 25% women on boards was set. That was basically achieved at the end of that 5-year period. And then it became the Hampton-Alexander Review, where they set a target of 33% for women on boards. And now we're in the third and successor review, which is the FTSE Women Leaders Review, where the target has been set at 40%. So the history of the review goes back 15 years, which is quite unique in this space. We're also supported by UK government, so the Department for Business and Trade, as well as the Office for Equality and Opportunity, support the initiative, but it is uniquely business-led, and the provision of the data is voluntary. So it's businesses taking the mandate effectively from government to redress the underrepresentation of women at the board and leadership level of the FTSE 350 and now the 50 largest private companies, and working out how they do it, and then reporting on that each year in a transparent way, which in effect creates an accountability cycle. So the review monitors those 400 companies each year and reports and then shares that data so we can see the progress not only made by individual companies, but made also by different sectors and then overall as well. Now, as I said, the approach in the UK is voluntary, and that is quite unique and it is world leading. And I'll show you some comparisons later about initiatives in other countries and how they compare. So next slide. So in terms of the review sets out to set a target of 40% representation of women on the FTSE 350 boards and also their leadership teams by 2025. And we've expanded that during this review to include 50 largest private companies as well. The review also focuses on what are seen as the 4 key decision-making roles. So it isn't just about a big headline number, it's actually about drilling down and looking at what are the roles that are really significantly important from a leadership and a culture perspective. And we determined that it was the chair, the CEO, the senior independent director, and the finance director. And I'll share with you the progress in relation to those roles a little bit later. But the other part of the review is that the review doesn't just stand on its own, led by business and supported by government. It actually engages with the whole community, that whole stakeholder community. So whether that is the investment sector or whether that is the executive search firms, there is an engagement model that brings all those different parts to the fore to support the ambition of that target. Because boards can't promote and access the talent at the board level and the leadership level unless that talent is coming through the search firms as well. And then support from all those sectors is hugely important. Next slide. This is just a summary of the 2 government departments who support us, Department for Business and Trade and the Office for Equality and Opportunity. Next slide. And when we talk about being sponsored and led by business, we have 2 financial sponsors and who sponsor us in terms of their support as well and their brand, and that's Lloyds Banking Group and KPMG. Next slide. So as I mentioned, this approach is quite unique and it is world leading. So in a comparison of the G7 countries, we can see that the UK comes second only to France at 43.4% women on boards. But you can also see that different countries follow different approaches. So UK, Canada, the US, and Japan all follow a voluntary approach, whereas it's much more driven by quotas in, for example, France and Germany. I think it's also worth noting that although France is 2% ahead of the UK, it really only measures the 40 companies in its public exchange, whereas the UK actually measures 350. So we're measuring many more companies and many more board roles in order to come to that data point. Next slide. So what is the summary? So this year, when we published the results in February, we found that although our target is 40%, actually, on average, the FTSE 350 companies had met and surpassed the target at 43%, which is hugely impressive. As I mentioned, it's only within this 5-year period that we've started to look at the 50 largest private companies. And in 3 years of data, we can see that they've now progressed to 31% women on boards. So unlikely to meet the target at the end of this year of 40%, but nonetheless, some really good starting progress. Next slide. If we split out that big number of 43%, how is it constructed? What's interesting to see is that for non-executive directors, it's effectively at parity. We have 50% men and women in those roles at the FTSE 350 level. But when we look at executive directors, it's really only 16%. And so that means that that's an area that we absolutely do need to focus on. For the 50 largest private companies, their overall figure is lower, but actually there's a greater balance between executive directors at 29% and non-executive directors at 33%. What's also interesting is that for the board roles in relation to the FTSE 350, in order to make and deliver that change of representation, that is actually real and tangible representation. So one of the things that we've also tracked is the overall number of total directorships. And what's interesting to see is that the overall number of total directorships has actually reduced by almost 100 over that period. So this isn't a question of adding people to the board to adjust the representation. It's actually changing the people on the board in order to achieve that outcome. The other interesting data point is that since 2020, neither the FTSE 100 nor the FTSE 250 has had any all-male boards. So when we started this journey in 2011, 152 companies had all-male boards, and since 2020, we've had none. In terms of the number of all-male boards for the 50 private companies, that was 8 in 2022. It's now reduced to 7 in 2024. So good progress there, although to be fair, we only have 3 years of data from which to work at this stage. Next slide, please. So where are we today in relation to women on boards across all the sectors? And this is, I think, a really interesting slide because it can show us all the different sectors, and we can see that mining fits into basic resources, and actually it's right in the middle. What's also interesting to note from this slide is that although financial services is at the top and automobiles and parts is at the bottom, the difference between them isn't that great. So just over 45% for financial services, but at automobiles and parts, actually, they really are edging quite closely toward 40%. So there's really not that much variation in this space. And we can see overall basic resources, both public and private companies in relation to boards have actually generally met that target. We'll have a look at the individual companies in detail later, but as a sector, that's really impressive, particularly given where the sector started from. Next slide. So let's have a look at leadership. Now, when we talk about leadership, what we're talking about is the C-suite and their direct reports. So C plus C minus 1. And so it is quite a group, a large group, but it's an important group in terms of organizations. What we've seen is that in the years that we've been measuring women in leadership since about 2019, actually the progress has been good, but not as strong as in relation to boards. So for the FTSE 350 at 35%, but for the 50 largest private companies in only 4 years and 3 years of data, actually 37%, which is hugely impressive. What we can also see is that the number of all-male executive committees in terms of leadership has moved from 54 in 2017 down to 10 in 2024. So again, some really impressive progress. Next slide, please. If we split that out, what we can also see is that 29% women on the executive committee, much stronger than we saw with executive directors on boards, and 36% women direct reports for the FTSE 350, which indicates a really strong pipeline toward the executive committee. And then in relation to the 50 largest private companies, again, very strong in that space as well. And for the 50 largest private companies, granted, we're measuring 50 versus 350 companies, but they've reduced the number of all-male executives from 3 until 1. You'll excuse me, I'm just going to stand up so my lights come back on. Ah, there they go. Right, next slide, please. So if we look at the overall picture in terms of women in leadership for the mining sector, not as strong as they were on boards, which is in the middle, but they're not at the back of the queue either. So again, a fairly good and strong showing, not quite at 30%, but above 25% and above automobiles and parts. So lots of progress still to be made, but what we have seen is incredibly strong. Next slide. So what is the progress that's been made in relation to boards overall in terms of the mining sector? Now, in 2011, it was 9.5%. In 2011, we weren't actually breaking out the different sectors. So for the first 6 or 7 years of the review, we were looking at this much more holistically. So when I say 9.5% is where we started in 2011, I can't tell you exactly where the mining sector was, but certainly overall in the FTSE 350, it was at 9.5%. By the end of 2015, we've seen that progression to 14.6%. And then by the end of 2020, we're seeing that progression to 28.7%. And then, as I said, this year, we're seeing that progression to 41.4% in terms of the mining sector. So really very consistent and impressive progress in relation to boards since the beginning of the review and over that 15-year period. Next slide. So here we can look in this a little bit more detail. So just over the period of this particular review, we can see the differences in terms of women on board representation, which is the darker purple, and then the leadership data, which is the executive committee and the direct reports, which is in lighter purple. So very strong and steady progress in relation to both boards and leadership. But the leadership piece is proving to be much slower in terms of actually moving the needle in a significant way. So it's still moving in the right direction, but actually very slowly. And we've only been measuring that again for half the period of the review. So what we're also seeing is that the starting point isn't quite the same as it is with boards. So next slide, please. And if we do a cut of the current companies that are within scope for the FTSE Women Leaders Review, both public and private, we can actually see where they individually are placed this year. And we've got 2 at the top, Anglo American PLC and Antofagasta at 45.5%, which is really impressive. But then quickly right behind them, the Weir Group at 44.4%, as well as Endeavour Mining. Again, really excellent showing there. And then everyone but 3 of them actually above the 40% threshold, which is really impressive. And we can also see where they are in terms of leadership. And so interestingly there with Fresnillo, they are above 40% in relation to boards, but actually they have the weakest when it comes to the weakest representation when it comes to leadership. So it's quite interesting to see that the progress in relation to boards is generally aligned with that of leadership, but not always. Next slide, please. Then I mentioned to you the 4 key roles. And the reason we focus on those 4 key roles is that between the chair and the CEO, they have a huge impact on the strategy of a company, as well as on the culture of a company. And they really set the direction and pace for an organization. And so when it comes to inclusive leadership, it's really important that we focus on those roles and ensure that those are the roles where we're also seeing balanced representation. So we have a relatively long history since 2017 of measuring the four key roles in relation to the FTSE 350. And what we can see is gradual and slow progression up for all of the roles except for the senior independent director, where it's kind of gone up like a rocket. In relation to the 50 largest private companies, it's only 3 years of data, which makes it very difficult to identify any particular trends. But we can see that it's progressing. It's either level or it's moving up a little bit and down a little bit, but nothing very dramatic going on there. So let's have a look at the numbers themselves. Next slide. So if we look at the FTSE 350, in terms of the representation of women in the chair role, and this, by the way, isn't the mining sector, this is across the board, it's at 17%, senior independent director over 50% at 56%, wow. CEO at 7%, the first time we've seen a fall in the numbers of female CEOs, and then finance director at 22%. So an increase in finance director, chair and senior independent director, a fall in relation to CEO, but you can see where the focus needs to be very much on CEO and chair. Next slide. And if we look at the 50 private companies, you will recall that in terms of the board piece, they are not as strong as the public companies, but in terms of leadership, they actually have stronger representation of women than the FTSE 350. So if we look at these four key roles, in the chair role at 15%, so it's a little bit below that of the FTSE 350 companies, but they actually have a stronger figure in relation to the senior independent director at 65%, and then interestingly, much stronger in relation to the women CEOs, but also seeing a fall in that number this year, just as with the FTSE 350. And then again on finance director, again, slightly stronger than the FTSE 350. So it's really interesting to see the differences between the public and private sector. Next slide. So I hope that's been helpful to give you a whistle-stop tour of the FTSE Women Leaders Review. I know we started a little bit late, so I wanted to not take away too much time from our panel discussion and our representatives from a range of mining firms who we're going to speak to in a moment. But what I've got popped on screen at the moment is actually a QR code. So if you put your camera on that, you can access the FTSE Women Leaders Review report. We publish that annually, and the date of the next review will be on the 24th of February in 2026. And it's an open invitation to anyone who'd like to listen in and hear the progress of the companies that are reporting their data and making incredible progress, because this requires an enormous amount of focus and effort, as I'm sure we're going to be hearing from our panelists in due course. So there's the QR code to our report. And if we move to the next slide, well, that's just say thank you.